I thought buying my dream cabin far away from my old HOA nightmare would finally give me peace, but I had no idea I was stepping into the epicenter of suburban madness. It was early Tuesday morning, the sun barely kissing the treetops, and I was sipping my first coffee on the deck, relishing the freedom I had paid extra for, freedom from rules about mailbox height, fence colors, and outdoor decorations. That's when I heard it, a shrill, ear-piercing scream that made my heart leap into my throat. I looked up and saw her, Karen Stevens, the infamous HOA president, standing on my property line like she owned the forest, decked out in a neon-orange safety vest, a crooked hard hat perched on her head, and a bullhorn in hand, pointing wildly at my cabin as if I had committed a crime against humanity. In one hand, she held a tiny 6-inch ruler, meticulously measuring distances that didn't matter to anyone but her, and in the other, she was already on the phone dialing 911. This structure violates HOA standards. Send enforcement immediately, she bellowed, voice echoing across the trees. I froze in my pajamas, coffee halfway to my mouth, wondering if I'd stumbled into an alternate reality where HOA presidents wielded imaginary powers like generals on a battlefield. She planted handmade signs that screamed "violation" in crooked red letters around my cabin, rolled out orange traffic cones, and snapped photos of everything, narrating loudly about evidence preservation and protecting community values. Every move she made seemed choreographed, like a twisted performance art piece, and I couldn't stop staring at the surreal scene unfolding in my own backyard. Minutes later, Officer Harris arrived, calm and professional, his eyes narrowing in confusion as Karen launched into her operatic description of my illegal structure and my supposed violations. I handed over my surveyor's report, showing clearly that my property was 47 meters outside her jurisdiction, and the disbelief on her face was priceless, her confidence collapsing like a house of cards. But then, in a move that would define the absurdity of everything to come, she raised her bullhorn and screamed, "We'll seize it by force if we have to." The words hung in the air, ridiculous and terrifying at the same time, and Officer Harris, unflinching, calmly explained the criminal consequences of threatening theft of private property. Karen's face cycled through shock, anger, and desperation, all while muttering about emergency powers and community standards that didn't exist. I stood there, heart racing, coffee cooling, realizing that I wasn't just dealing with a nosy neighbor. I was confronting someone completely unhinged, someone who had elevated suburban control to a dangerous performance of authority. My cabin, which I had thought was a sanctuary, had suddenly become a battleground, and I had no choice but to watch and document every bizarre action, knowing that this confrontation was just the opening act of what would become an all-out suburban war. Little did I know, this day would set the stage for months of escalating madness, where HOA rules, fake authority, and a woman's obsession with control would collide in ways I could never imagine, and where my quiet life on a perfectly legal property would be anything but peaceful. And that, my friends, is exactly why you need to stick around, hit like, and subscribe. Because what starts with a tiny ruler and a bullhorn quickly spirals into chaos, deception, and a battle over property rights you have to see to believe. I barely had time to process Karen's threat when she began her next act of absurdity, assembling what she clearly considered an enforcement team. A ragtag group of neighbors wearing mismatched orange vests and looking as confused and terrified as I felt, while I stood on my deck, coffee forgotten, watching this suburban circus unfold in real time. Bob Miller, her loyal sidekick, shuffled nervously at her side, clutching a clipboard as if it could shield him from the legal storm brewing, while Karen barked orders like a general preparing troops for battle, pointing at my cabin, her bullhorn still raised high, shouting about compliance inspections, emergency powers, and threats to property values. I pulled out my phone and started recording, knowing this would be evidence if things spiraled further, because it was clear they would. Mrs. Patterson, a sweet elderly neighbor, looked like she'd rather be anywhere else in the world, questioning repeatedly whether this was legal. But Karen ignored her, coaching the team on how to assert authority and conduct inspections of my supposedly illegal cabin. They fumbled with fake badges, laminated forms, and clipboards, as Karen insisted that their mission was critical to the survival of community standards, and I couldn't believe the sheer commitment to delusion on display. Meanwhile, I realized my cabin, my peaceful escape from HOA tyranny, was being treated like a crime scene, and I was trapped in pajamas, sipping rapidly cooling coffee, documenting every misstep. Officer Harris arrived again, eyeing the scene with the patience of someone who had clearly seen it all but still couldn't hide his disbelief, and Karen immediately launched into her rehearsed spiel, waving papers, shouting about unauthorized construction and aesthetic violations that had no jurisdictional basis, all while the neighbors behind her awkwardly followed her lead, clearly aware of the legal danger but paralyzed by her intensity. The tension hit a peak when she demanded I produce legal documentation proving my property's independence, which I did, placing my surveyor's report carefully on the deck table, showing bright orange stakes marking the boundaries beyond her reach. Her mouth fell open, her team froze mid-step, and I could almost see the gears in her head grinding as the illusion of authority collapsed around her. But instead of retreating, Karen doubled down, yelling that she had emergency powers and that noncompliance could lead to seizure, while Officer Harris calmly, methodically, and firmly reminded her of the criminal consequences of impersonating an official and threatening theft. My neighbor's compliance melted away in real time. Bob shuffled backward, Mrs. Patterson dropped her clipboard, Mr. Hendricks peeled off his vest like it was a hot coat, and within seconds, Karen was standing alone, bullhorn in hand, shouting into space while I continued recording, my heart pounding, knowing that this footage was now a potential legal goldmine. What was supposed to be a peaceful morning of coffee on my deck had transformed into an epic battle of absurdity versus legality, where every measure, every yell, every fake badge served as evidence of escalating delusion. And as Karen continued to rant, I realized the situation wasn't just about my cabin anymore. It was about documenting the systematic unraveling of someone who had confused HOA leadership with law enforcement, who believed that measuring every inch of someone else's property justified criminal threats. By the time she finally stomped off, muttering about calling someone with real authority, I had captured hours of footage, screenshots, and timestamp notes, already anticipating the months of chaos that would follow. And that's exactly why you need to like, subscribe, and stay tuned, because this story doesn't stop here. Karen's obsession was only beginning, and every measure, every post, every irrational claim would escalate into a suburban saga that you will not believe until you see it unfold. Just when I thought the chaos of the morning was the peak of absurdity, my neighbor Linda pulled me aside later that evening, a glint in her eye that immediately set off alarm bells. She had discovered something about Karen's property that I knew would change everything. Armed with her own tape measure and a folder of research materials, she led me on a stealth mission across the street under the cover of darkness, whispering theories about Karen's obsession with boundaries and what it could mean if her own property wasn't exactly compliant. As we approached her backyard, I could barely believe my eyes. Karen's deck extended well beyond her property line onto what was clearly county easement land, at least 4 feet past the markers, a violation that made her obsessive scrutiny of my cabin's boundaries look hypocritical to the extreme. My heart pounded as Linda pulled out photocopied survey reports from the county recorder's office, dated years back, confirming the encroachment and proving Karen had known about it for 3 years. Every furious measurement she had taken, every 911 call, every bullhorn lecture about imaginary violations suddenly had a context. She was creating a smokescreen to justify her own violations while establishing a precedent that might protect her from consequences. The irony was so thick I could taste it. Karen, the self-proclaimed protector of community standards, had been living in violation herself the entire time, while terrorizing neighbors over rules that didn't apply to me. Linda and I documented everything meticulously, measuring, photographing, and noting the encroachment with a precision that would have made Karen proud, had she been on the right side of the law. The next morning, I watched in stunned fascination as she returned to her routine, rolling out her surveyor's wheel, snapping photos, and narrating into her phone about visual pollution and aesthetic compliance, completely oblivious to the evidence we had collected. This was no longer a quirky neighbor story. It had transformed into a strategic unraveling of someone whose obsession with authority had become a criminal endeavor. Karen wasn't just enforcing phantom rules. She was systematically attempting to rewrite property law in her favor, while leaving a trail of harassment and chaos that could now be documented in irrefutable detail. Every post on her neighborhood app, every photo collage, every time-stamped inspection became part of the growing mountain of evidence, and I realized that months of careful documentation could turn this suburban nightmare into a story of ultimate vindication. Officer Harris, when informed of the findings, nodded with a gravity that reinforced my understanding. This wasn't petty HOA drama anymore. It was a criminal investigation in the making, and every tape, every survey stake, every recorded conversation would become critical in proving a pattern of harassment and false authority. Karen's empire of imagined control was on the verge of collapse, and I could almost feel the tension as if the wind itself whispered the beginning of her downfall. By midweek, the situation escalated further when she began calling meetings and attempting to rally neighbors with her emergency enforcement powers, unaware that every step she took was now being documented for legal review. Linda, my steadfast ally, had become the unofficial archivist, capturing each moment with precision, compiling a visual and written record that left no room for doubt. Karen had overstepped repeatedly, and now the evidence was undeniable. And that's exactly why you have to like, subscribe, and stay tuned. Because the story doesn't pause here. Karen's delusions were about to collide with real law, neighbors' courage, and a set of facts that would force a reckoning she never anticipated, setting the stage for a confrontation that would define the limits of HOA power and suburban sanity alike. The morning air was crisp, but my nerves were anything but calm. Karen Stevens, fueled by her obsession, had transformed from a quirky HOA president into a full-on suburban warlord, assembling a small but alarmingly serious crew of neighbors in bright orange vests, each clutching clipboards, fake badges, and expressions that mixed fear with confusion, while she strutted in front like a general bullhorn at the ready, declaring that my cabin posed a grave threat to community standards and that her squad had full authority to inspect and enforce compliance. I stood on my deck, coffee in hand, still in pajamas, recording every insane move, knowing that documentation was my shield because Officer Harris had warned me that this could escalate quickly. Karen barked orders, waving laminated papers, pointing at imaginary boundaries, and yelling about emergency powers, while Bob Miller, her trembling second-in-command, tried to follow her commands without really understanding what he was participating in. Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Atrix shuffled behind her, awkwardly trying to maintain the illusion of legitimacy, until I stepped forward and calmly demanded legal proof of their authority to enter my property. Karen froze for a fraction of a second, realization flickering in her eyes, but she quickly recovered with a flurry of words and bullhorn volume, insisting that their powers were absolute. Then Officer Harris arrived, calm and professional, assessing the chaos with a look that combined disbelief and patience, and he finally told Karen that threatening to seize property outside her jurisdiction was illegal, and impersonating an official carried serious consequences. It was mesmerizing to watch her carefully constructed fantasy unravel in real time. Bob slunk away, Mrs. Patterson dropped her clipboard, Mr. Atrix removed his vest and retreated, leaving Karen standing alone, furious, waving her papers and bullhorn, shouting into space while the neighborhood gathered quietly, mesmerized by the absurd spectacle. Linda, my ever-vigilant neighbor and archivist, documented everything, capturing video that would later become crucial evidence. Every shouted claim of authority, every flailing arm, every attempted justification was now part of an irrefutable record of harassment and impersonation. Karen, still clinging to her delusions, tried to justify emergency powers and enforce imaginary standards, but Officer Harris methodically explained HOA limits, trespassing laws, and the criminal implications of her actions. The ridiculousness peaked when she attempted to lecture me about visual pollution and community integrity while standing on public property with nothing but her bullhorn and fake badge. Within minutes, her so-called enforcement squad had completely dissolved, leaving her isolated and exposed, shouting into the wind while the neighborhood processed what had just happened. By evening, her phone was ringing with angry calls from neighbors who had witnessed the incident, and the HOA board convened an emergency meeting to review evidence, video footage, and testimonies. The proof of criminal impersonation, harassment, and false enforcement was overwhelming. Karen's delusions had crossed into unlawful behavior, and the board quickly voted to remove her from office, initiate legal review, and establish new policies explicitly limiting HOA authority to prevent future incidents. I finally exhaled, watching the chaos dissipate as order returned to the neighborhood, bronze survey stakes gleaming in the fading light, serving as a permanent reminder that careful preparation, patience, and documentation could withstand even the most absurd, obsessive attempts at control. Linda, ever the meticulous chronicler, reminded me that this was only the beginning of ensuring accountability. But for now, the spectacle of Karen Stevens' suburban meltdown had ended, leaving a neighborhood wiser, calmer, and more vigilant than ever before. The day of the hearing arrived, and I felt a mixture of relief and anticipation as I stepped into the county courthouse, the air thick with tension and murmurs from neighbors who had followed every absurd twist of Karen Stevens' reign. Linda sat beside me, her folder of meticulously organized videos, photos, and documents clutched tightly, ready to ensure the truth was impossible to ignore, while Karen entered wearing a carefully curated look of authority that now seemed hollow, her orange vest conspicuously absent but her delusions intact, as if sheer force of will could rewrite law. The courtroom itself became a stage for the surreal drama that had begun months earlier on my quiet cabin deck. The prosecutor systematically laid out the timeline of escalating harassment, fraudulent badges, fake enforcement crews, repeated 911 calls, and illegal attempts to seize private property, each piece of evidence accompanied by Linda's recordings and Officer Harris's body cam footage, leaving no room for doubt about the pattern of criminal behavior. Karen's defense attorney tried to paint her as an overzealous, well-intentioned citizen, sincerely concerned for neighborhood standards, but the court had already seen the exhaustive documentation showing intentional abuse of emergency services, impersonation of an official, and threats of property seizure, and Judge Harrison's expression suggested she was less than convinced. Witnesses testified. Bob Miller recounted his fearful compliance. Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Atrix admitted they had been manipulated, and even neutral neighbors described the intimidation and confusion Karen had caused, while I provided official survey documentation proving my property was entirely outside HOA jurisdiction, with bronze markers and legal reports confirming my boundaries. The most damning moment came when the prosecutor revealed Karen's own violation, the deck that extended onto public easement land, highlighting her motive for attempting to expand HOA authority and shield herself from accountability. The irony was unmistakable, and a murmur ran through the courtroom as photographs, measurements, and county notices were displayed for all to see. After hours of testimony, cross-examinations, and legal arguments, Judge Harrison rendered a decisive verdict. Karen Stevens was sentenced to 6 months of supervised probation, ordered to pay fines and court costs, and issued a permanent restraining order preventing her from coming within 100 feet of my property, while being required to complete community service and attend a civic responsibility course, emphasizing that HOA leaders are not law enforcement and that no amount of imagined authority can override the law. The HOA board swiftly enacted reforms, clarifying jurisdiction, hearing professional management, and implementing transparent procedures to prevent rogue enforcement, ensuring the nightmare of arbitrary authority could never repeat, while neighbors slowly began to rebuild trust and normalcy after months of fear and chaos. In the weeks that followed, Linda compiled her archive into a comprehensive documentary, capturing the full arc of the story, and even Officer Harris received recognition for his professionalism in handling the most bizarre property dispute in department history. Karen's departure from the neighborhood months later marked the final curtain on her delusional crusade, the sale of her house symbolic of a return to order, while the permanent bronze survey markers at my cabin became a lasting testament to the power of preparation, legal awareness, and community support against harassment and abuse of authority. As I sat on my deck, coffee in hand, the trees casting long shadows over my clearly defined property lines, I realized the lessons of this suburban saga were profound. Documenting boundaries, standing firm, questioning authority, and remaining calm in the face of absurdity can protect your rights more effectively than confrontation ever could. And that sometimes, even the most determined bullhorn-wielding HOA president must ultimately bow to law, reason, and truth. The cabin was peaceful once more, the neighborhood slowly healing, and I couldn't help but smile at the sheer audacity of the events that had unfolded, proof that vigilance, evidence, and patience always triumph over delusion, no matter how loud or determined.